Hi, Andrea. Kind of crazy screen here at this moment. But anyway, you asked for a review of chapter 12, 13, and 14. You can imagine we're going to fly. I don't know if you have a question, I'm not sure if you can ask that question on here, but that's fine. You try it if you want to. So, exam number 4, and you've got 3 chapters on there, 12, 13, and 14. So in your textbook, in your lecture book, and you probably have one, but you can certainly write down chapter 12, and then you can look these things up. So first of all, the general functions on page 423, you want to understand those and apply them. There's sensory functions where you pick up messages from the environment, like wind and rain or whatever. And then you've got integrative functions where you think about what's happening and you make a decision. That's pretty wild, isn't it? Make a decision in all those cells up there. And then those cells send out impulses we call motor functions. So you either run inside the house because you don't want to get hit by lightning or something like that. But anyway, that's just an overview of the functions there. And as you look at the last paragraph, it's under that overview of CNS functions, it talks about the brain receives and processes sensory information, and then you read on through it about just what I've said. Brain processes it, sends out motor impulses so that you can make a response to the environment. So as you look over on the second column, you come down toward the middle and you see the components of the brain that sits inside our skull. And then you come down to the bottom and you see spinal cord, and you can read about that. So you want to know the components of the brain, and they give you some picture over on page 424. In your textbook, you've got the cerebrum and some of the functions, Diencephalon, some of the functions. We're going to get into it a little bit in detail in a few minutes, cerebellum and the brainstem. So those are the 4 main things that you want to know about the brain. Now, I want you to notice something as you look over on page 424, the second column, and you see in bold print there, white matter and gray matter. Gray matter doesn't have any myelin, white matter does. And it actually shows up, according to them, sort of gray and white. But anyway, you want to know about that. And as you look on page 425, in that first column, in the first paragraph, you see tracts and nuclei. So nuclei are collections of neuron cell bodies, whereas the tracts are, at least inside your central nervous system, they're myelinated. And so there's a difference in their color. Now, as you look over on page 427, you probably have been over this in lab. So really I'm just going to fly through here. So you want to know these structures on page 427, the parts of the brain. And we're going to get into a little more depth in just a minute. But as you look on page 427, you look to the top right, and you see the brain, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. And then you have the insula, which is underneath, where the lower end of the frontal meets the temporal lobe. And you look to the left there and you see longitudinal fissure, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. You guys know that stuff from lab. Now you look over on page 428, and you see this colored version of the brain. And so you can see that the frontal lobe is dealing with motor skills, when you go past the central sulcus and you get back on the parietal lobe, you see somatosensory cortex. That's what picks up the messages from our nerves. And then the association areas help you discern what you are feeling. So you got a set of neurons that pick up something happening, but then you begin to process that information that's coming in, and you say, oh, well, I know that's rain coming down, or that's a wind coming down, or whatever, or pine needles coming out of a tree, and you're getting bombarded by them. So the sensory area like that picks up the information. The association area integrates it. Over the years, we get a number of pieces of information that the association area puts together so that we make a judgment as to what we're looking at, feeling, or whatever. And you see the primary visual cortex to the right. So there's where you pick up images, and then you got a visual association area. And if you're looking at this YouTube, you look at me and you say, oh, I know that's Mr. Pritchett. That's not Mr. Malachowski. And so you can work your way around. There's Wernicke's area involved with speech, auditory association and primary auditory. That's dealing with hearing. You recognize sounds in the association area. Broca's area is the another aspect of our ability to be able to speak. And so you get the idea about some of the functions that the brain is involved in. As you look on page 430, and this is in your, let's see, we're in, that Word document. We're on page 2 now in this document that I sent you. And you can look at the bottom, figure 12.1, this frontal section. And notice the brown on the outside. And that's your unmyelinated neurons. Then you see the lighter area, that's myelinated. Now, I ask you in the Word document to note those purple cords are strings, however you want to put them. It's actually neurons. But that's part of, as you look right above, you see it says commissural fibers of the corpus callosum. We have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and they are connected by these commissural fibers of the corpus callosum. And you saw that in the lab, I believe. That's white matter that connects the right side of our brain with the left side of our brain. And you can see the association areas, association fibers, and projection fibers, and they connect things so that we behave as we think as a single response to certain things in the environment and also inside our body. So you can read about the projection fibers and the association fibers on page 431. Now we come over to another part of we've been looking at the cerebrum over there. So now we're looking at the diencephalon. So I've written that out in the Word document. It's always kind of interesting to me. They talk about the diencephalon. Di usually is 2, but they have 4 parts here. They got the subthalamus, the epithalamus, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. That's 4 for me, but I'm not sure exactly how that comes about. But anyway, as you look on page 433, you see the word thalamus, and you want to look at that first paragraph, and that's going to tell you that the thalamus actually forms the walls of a cavity in our brain called the third ventricle. Now, the thalamus, if you come down into the second paragraph, you see it says thalamic nuclei. Those are neuron cell bodies, no myelin or anything like that. But you come down about 4 or 5 lines and you see it says it's literally the main entrance to the rest of the brain. So the thalamus is like a railroad station where trains are coming in and then they go back out different ways. And so it sends the information that we're getting from our fingers, our ears, our eyes, or whatever goes into the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it as a relay station to the appropriate part. Think about a kid's brain inside the womb, and you think about that brain developing and all those little connections being made in there so they can think correctly, respond correctly, receive information. Just blows me away. That's why I'm here. I really love this stuff. But you come on down about to the next one called a hypothalamus, and you want to know its basic functions there. And it talks about the pituitary, how that is hanging on to the hypothalamus. And actually, the hypothalamus helps to order some activities, chemical activities in the pituitary gland, which produces a number of hormones. And you see the big word infundibulum. As you come past that, you come on down a little bit more about hypothalamus. Produces 2 additional hormones, and that's oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. All right, let's see now. Hypothalamus, as we mentioned, I think later in 13 or 14, hypothalamus really kind of runs your autonomic nervous system. Now you don't worry about epithalamus and subthalamus, but come down to cerebellum and the structures that make it up, the cerebellar hemispheres and the vermis. You can see that on the next page. If you look at the pictures on figure 1211, you get to see over in B parts, you see the hemispheres, the right and the left, and then you see vermis, which means worm in German. And let's see, there's, if you look back on page 433, you see it talks about the functions there. Coordinated activities, whether it be your lips, or whether it be your skeletal muscles in the sense of playing a game of volleyball and you knock the ball with your hands and you jump at the same time. And so that cerebellum is involved in that kind of activity. So it's involved in coordinated movements that the whole body gets involved in. You can imagine, I think I've mentioned this, what's that little girl's name? Starts with an S, I can't think of her, but she's the best gymnast in the world at this moment. So her cerebellum is working wonderfully because she just is so gifted in her abilities to do things physically in gymnastics. 434, you come down to the brain stem. And you want to know the 3 components that make up the brainstem. You want to know what roles they play. There's some pictures over on page 435 where you can see the brainstem working your way around to the right. You see midbrain, pons, and medulla. Working to the right, you see cerebellum and cerebral aqueduct. These are parts that you already know from exposure to the information in lab. Might have a picture like that on the test and ask you to identify that. Now you look at the brain stem, and there are the 3 parts. You can read through there on page 434, and you look on 436, and you see midbrain, and they tell you a little bit about it there, but come over to page 437 and you see in that first column, the nuclei of the midbrain has diverse functions, certain reflexes, movement, sensation, and so forth. Pons, that's between the midbrain and the medulla. And you come over to the right in the second column on 437, and you see the pontine nuclei have diverse roles, especially those required for breathing. There's a lot of things that go on that we still are discovering. We don't have a complete understanding of those things. So we're finding out about them still. Medulla oblongata, that's the last part of the brain stem before it becomes the spinal cord. And one of the things I mentioned in the Word document is on page 438. It says, on the anterior surface of the medulla, we find elevated ridges known as the pyramid. And notice it says you don't have to worry about upper motor neurons or anything like that, but the pyramids consist of the corticospinal tract. Now, suppose I put that down like that, and I said, is that a sensory tract or is it a motor tract? You expect me to think, Mr. Pritchett? Right? Well, cortico means it starts in the cortex and goes down to the spine. So it would be a motor tract. Okay, it's going to be myelinated. And so what happens, and you read in that paragraph, is that these tracts, these corticospinal tracts coming from both sides of the cerebrum, they cross in the medulla. And they call that crossing decussation. That's why when a person loses control, say, of the right arm and maybe their right leg, that means there's been a problem up here in the left cerebral hemisphere because of the crossing over. I'm not sure why that happens. All we can do sometimes as scientists and teachers is just say, well, that's just the way God made us. We don't know why, but that's the way it is. All right, so let's scoot over to page 441. And you see homeostasis, role of the brain in the maintenance of homeostasis. Then you can read about the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on page 441, first lines there. And you come down to homeostasis of vital function. And here we get a first mention of the autonomic nervous system. Now, what do you not want to call it? Well, we don't want to call it the automatic nervous system. It does respond automatically, but it is independent of our thinking. So our control over various things, it's going to control and keep homeostasis going as best it can. So you can see over here on the right-hand column of 441, the main boss of the ANS is the hypothalamus, which receives sensory input from the viscera. What does that mean? The components of the limbic system, we didn't cover into that, and the cerebral cortex. You come down, it says the hypothalamus accomplishes this task largely by relaying instructions to the nuclei in the reticular formation. Don't worry about that. Just understand the hypothalamus is basically in charge of the autonomic nervous system. Blood pressure, as you see there in that little section on vasopressor and vasodepressor center, come down to body temperature, get hungry and so forth. That's where your hypothalamus comes in to control things so that you get a meal and put something in your tummy. So you can read about the hypothalamus on page 442, that first and second paragraph there. Now let's scoot over to protection of the brain on page 449. And you already know the skull helps to protect, the cranium helps protect the brain. Now, what we're interested in here is you come down in that second column on page 449, you come down to where you see cranial meninges, cerebrospinal fluid, and so forth, blood-brain barrier. So, come to the bottom, you got the cranial meninges. Basically, you have three layers. You've got the outer layer called the dura mater, and I'm looking on page 450, figure 1222. Tough, okay? You move in and you get to the arachnoid matter or mater, like spider web, arachnophobia. We caught a big old wolf spider in the mountains one time when we were with our grandsons on vacation. That was an arachnid. So this is arachnoid, like a web that a spider would weave. And then you have a pia mater, which is right on top of the brain. Okay. So you want to read the paragraphs down at the bottom of page 450. And as you look at figure 1222, and you look at the bottom figure, you're looking at a frontal section. And you can see over to the right, the meningeal dura, the subdural space. Sometimes you can get a bleed in there. They call it a subdural hematoma. The arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space, that's the space in which cerebrospinal fluid is moving. Pia mater right on top. Now, notice the very center at the top of that person's skull, that little illustration, and you see where it says superior sagittal sinus. That's actually carrying blood back from our brains down to the heart and the lungs again. And you see in the arachnoid mater, you see those little arachnoid trabeculae. Remember trabeculae from the bones? So locate that term. It's real close to pia mater, down a little bit and to the left. And then you see these arachnoid granulations. And those are ways for cerebrospinal fluid to exit the subarachnoid space. We're going to mention that in just a few minutes, and we'll hopefully make things a little bit clearer for you. On page 451, arachnoid mater. You want to read about that. It's basically going to say the same thing I said a minute ago. And then you come down to the ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. So look over on page 452. And I don't think you've studied the heart in 210. You think, some of you, when you think of ventricles, you think of the heart. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. They just decided to name these two because they're cavities in our brains. So as you look on 452, you see these blue structures. Now they're deep inside the brain. They're not on the surface. They're deep inside. And you probably found that out in the lab when you looked at the model. So you see lateral ventricles up there at figure 1223, interventricular foramen. Don't worry about all the horns of the lateral ventricles. We're not going to get into all of that. But then you see third ventricle. See how it looks like a little bird's head? And then you look to the right and you see it's very narrow. And the walls of the third ventricle are composed of the thalamus. So this interventricular foramen connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. And then from the third ventricle, there is a little tube they call the cerebral aqueduct, which goes into an expanded area called the fourth ventricle. And then that expanded area narrows and becomes the central canal of the spinal cord. There is a flow of fluid going through there in me and in you. Now, where does this fluid come from? Look in the second column, and you see in the second paragraph of the second column on 452, this is in the lecture text, you see choroid plexuses. That's a network of capillaries that produce cerebrospinal fluid. You remember the ependymal cells? They have the little cilia that move. They move that fluid. It's a flow all the time through the brain. Fresh cerebrospinal fluid from the choroid plexus pushed along by the ependymal cells. So you can look at the bottom and you see 1, 2, 3, and 4 down there. This is in the second paragraph. It just basically says what I'm saying to you. Now, when fluid gets into the the fourth ventricle, it can go down the cord, go down the central canal of the cord, but it also goes into the subarachnoid space. Look on page 453. And look right in the middle of the picture, and you see these two little black arrows. And then what they're coming from is that's an indication of the fluid that's been produced by that kind of pinkish red stuff called the choroid plexus. Goes through the interventricular foramen, which they don't draw for you. And it goes into the third ventricle. And then it goes down. They've got let's see, do they have the third ventricle? They do not have that labeled. But where you see those two black arrows coming out into that little blue area, that is going to be the third ventricle. And you follow those black arrows. They go down through the aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, which is between the pons and the medulla and the cerebellum. You see the black arrows going down the central canal, and you see some of it going up over to the right a little bit. And so it gets into the subarachnoid space. And so our brain is in this fluid and floats. Protection, great protection. Obviously, you can see all these players on football teams and get their head all banged up. Sometimes it's pretty tough, and they start losing it because of the contusions and the concussions they get. But as you follow those arrows up there, you see where some of the arrows go up. This is on top of the brain. And those little arrows go out into what's called the superior sagittal sinus. CSF came from blood. It circulates around the brain, and it doesn't have blood cells in it. It's more like plasma. But it gives us a floating barrier of protection against for the brain and for the spinal cord. But as I said, we're always making it, we're remanufacturing it. You see the little arrows going out into the superior sagittal sinus. So, see where the flow is, and you see, if you look closely, you can see in the third ventricle, you've got the choroid plexus there. You look at the little red thing in the fourth ventricle, and you've got it there. And so it's just a great cushion. It works wonderfully. Okay, so you want to know the flow of cerebrospinal fluid and its purpose. Where does it go after it gets out of the arachnoid villi? Okay. Let's see now. On page 454, first little paragraph talks about there the brain is protected not only from threats outside the body, but from within, viruses and bacteria and so forth. And that COVID virus is messing stuff up, messing up blood vessels, which could lead to some strokes or whatever. But you see there, it's a blood-brain barrier. And we talked about the astrocytes and how they help to produce that blood-brain barrier. Just protects us from microorganisms as much as it can. On page 455, you have the spinal cord. So as you look on that first column, you see the bold print term down about the first paragraph, spinal cord, responsible for relaying and processing stimuli. It's a relay station. It's a processing station also. And it is, as you come down to protection of the spinal cord, it's got the same three tissues around it. So our cord floats in spinal fluid for protection. Now, let's see here. On page 456, you see external spinal cord anatomy. And there's some things in there I checked off for you, and I wrote them down in your Word document. You look at where it says external spinal cord anatomy, conus medullaris, spinal terminale, lumbar cervical enlargement, spinal nerves, cauda equina, and so forth. So you have this picture over on 457, and you can see, as you look at the picture, you see cervical enlargement, and you see a lumbar enlargement. Then you see the cauda equina coming down. It's in that area of the cauda equina where they do these taps, spinal taps, to draw some fluid out, to look at under a microscope and see if there are any bacteria in there. You can't see viruses because they're way too small. And then you see the phylum terminale. Now we're going to look at the picture on page 458. 458 has a figure 1228 cross section, and I went over the parts that you should know, and also the fact that the posterior horns, those are sensory. They receive information from our arms and legs and so forth. And then you see the lateral horn and the anterior horn. Those are anterior because they're on the front side of the spinal cord, but they send out neurons that are going to go to our muscles, and so that we can control those things. And you see a central canal, just like we started up at the top, and here it is. And there's a gray commissure that connects. It looks like a little brown butterfly, doesn't it? And so that's a connection there of gray matter. Gray matter. No myelin. The white on the outside is called myelinated. It's white matter. Got lipid, a lot of lipid around it. That's what I think we learned back in chapter 11. You got these cells that wrap around neurons in various places, and that's the myelin sheath, made out of lipids. Now you notice that if you look to the posterior, which would actually be up the page a little bit, you see the posterior root. Notice it's sensory. It's bringing in messages to the spinal cord. Then you have a root ganglion, and that's those nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system. And then you look down at the bottom and you see the anterior root, which comes either from the lateral horn or the anterior horn. Those are motor. Isn't it amazing how they get it all right? They just are in the right place to do the right thing at the right time. And you see the anterior root comes out and joins the posterior root. Now you got a mixed nerve, a mixed nerve. You can see some will go to muscle, some will go to things like your bladder, your viscera, some will go to your skin, all those little things we talked about like Merkel's discs and so forth. Now, when you look at the white matter, remember the white matter in the central nervous system is called tracts, Tracts. Look over on page 459. And in your Word document, we talked about the tracts. Some originate in the spinal cord and go up to the brain. Some originate in the brain and come down to the spinal cord. And I had you check off, as you look to the right of figure 1229 on page 459, you see spinocerebellar tracts. Spino originates in the spine. Cerebellar terminates there. Therefore, this is a sensory tract. You come down to the next box and you see descending. Obviously, the spinocerebellar is ascending. Descending, corticospinal, which we've already talked about. That's motor and function. There are a lot of different tracts. Aren't you glad you don't have to learn them all? Just a couple of them. And the names give them away to you. All right, let's see. We skipped a lot of stuff in here. Just can't cover it all. Those of you that want to go on to PA school, you will get a heavier dose. But at least you'll have a foundation and you'll recognize a lot of the vocabulary. So now we're through with chapter 12. We're going to look at chapter 13. We're on page 475. Peripheral means it's outside. So we have a peripheral sensory system and we have a peripheral motor system. So as we look over on page 476, you look at that top paragraph and look at the second sentence. It says the CNS processes input and then transmits the impulses through the PNS to effectors. We have receptors that pick things up, transfer it into the central nervous system, and then we send out messages after we've integrated and thought about it and said, I know this is a tick crawling on my hair, on my arm, or something like that. And then it's going to go to an effector, which would be a muscle in that case. So as you look at this picture on page 476, starting on the left-hand side, let's look at right in the middle. There's your central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Somatic, that's your body, okay? Not the viscera, okay? But body, hands, feet, skin all around you, some things like that. Somatic sensory, so you've got receptors, like you can see my eye, right, Lindrea? You can see my eyes, and I can't see you. But anyway, picks up the impulses, goes into the central nervous system. You make choices. And you see these blue ones that come from the skin, from the muscle and so forth. They get inside and they tell you, oh, somebody's bending my arm back the wrong way. Goes into the central nervous system. And then you jump over to the right side, PNS motor. Notice the term efferent. Afferent means it goes to the central nervous system. Efferent means it comes from the central nervous system to some kind of an effector. And you see it innervating a muscle. Now go back to the left side, and you see the visceral sensory. That's our GI tract. That's our bladder and so forth. So messages are sent from the organs to the central nervous system, and then they can come back out of the central nervous system to the bladder or to the heart or whatever, so that an appropriate response is made. So what we have just talked about is pretty much what's on 477. In the motor division, as you look on page 477, you come down to visceral motor division. Visceral now, this doesn't go to your fingers, doesn't go to your toes, doesn't go to your calves or anything like that. But visceral motor is what's going to innervate your GI tract, your bladder, your heart, and so forth. And you got the two divisions called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic is usually described as your fight or flight nervous system. It's going to get you all fired up to get out of the way of something. And then the parasympathetic is your rest and digest. So, don't have any conscious control over the autonomic nervous system. Now, on page 477, we covered the peripheral nerves, spinal nerves, and cranial nerves. These are outside of your central nervous system. Now, at the bottom, you see the layers of connective tissue that go around a neuron. Epineurium sounds a little bit like epimysium, doesn't it? And then perineurium, you can look that over. There's a nice picture on page 478, 13.2. And you already know about the anatomy of the spinal cord up there, but here they show you the anatomy of a nerve, and it kind of resembles a muscle fiber, doesn't it, in that sense? It doesn't do any contracting, but it certainly carries a message to your muscles so they can contract. But you can see you have an epineurium, a perineurium, then you have groups of axons, and that's called a fascicle. And then what goes around each individual neuron is an endoneurium, just like the endomysium in a muscle. Surrounds a muscle fiber. I think you're probably okay with the that I told you I wanted you to know the on page 479 the cranial nerves, and so you see them on page 480. So you want to know those names. You want to know the numbers, like numbers 8 is the vestibulocochlear, and you want to know what it innervates. Is it a sensory nerve? Is it a motor nerve? Is it a mixed nerve, like the facial nerve? Mixed means you've got sensory and motor. So you can feel things crawl on your face at night. But then again, you love this course so much, you hot dog anatomy brings a smile, and your facial nerve is involved in that smile. Okay, so you want to know those. And let's scoot over to page 489. Page 489 speaks about the structure of spinal nerves and spinal nerve plexuses. So you come down that long paragraph to the long column, 1, 2, 3, fourth paragraph, and you see it starts talking about the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. 8 of them you've got for the cervical region, 12 in the thoracic, 5 in the lumbar, 5 in the sacrum, and then you have 1 in the coccygeal. So you want to know that. You got 12 cranial nerves, you got 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and then you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now notice over on page 489, come down under cervical plexuses, and there it gives you, let's see if it gives you a definition there. It's really a conglomeration of connecting a number of nerves to each other. That's about as easy as you can get it, I think. But you come down to where you see phrenic nerve. That's a nerve that comes off your cervical area that is going to help control your respiration, your diaphragm, which is your major muscle of inspiration. Look over on page 490, and you look at the cervical plexus up at the top of page 490. They don't just they come off as single nerves, but then they connect with each other. And that connection is called a plexus. You don't have a thoracic plexus, but you have a cervical plexus. And so what that does is send several muscles, say, down the arm or something like that. So if something gets damaged up here at one level, it doesn't just ruin the whole arm. You can still use your arm to some degree. But you don't have to go memorize all those names. Don't worry about lesser occipital and greater auricular and all that stuff. But that's what a collection of nerves coming off, in this case, the cervical area, and they connect with each other. That's called a cervical plexus. Now, let's scoot over to page 495. And you look at the picture, figure 13.9. You see this big nerve called the sciatic nerve coming down the backside, the buttocks, and it goes all the way down to the heel. Sciatic nerve is the largest and the longest nerve in your body. Okay. Now on page 496, under distribution of spinal nerves, you see the picture of the lady there? Cervical makes you think it's only dealing with the neck. But what happens is you've got a lot of nerves coming off the neck region. But look at the light purple where you see on the front of this lady and on the back. The left side is the anterior surface. The right side is the posterior surface. And so those nerves innervate that area of your shoulder and your arm. I've got a bulging disc in one of my cervical I've got a bulging disc between two cervical vertebrae. And sometimes I can feel this sensation going down my arm. And so it's putting some pressure on there. Be nice to get it fixed. Not bad enough to mess with at this point. I just baby it. I think the last thing in this particular chapter, 502, is on about dermatomes. And you can see the dermatomes on page 502, figure 1315. You can see where the green is up there. Look, it goes all the way down. Cervical C6, that's the sixth nerve coming off from the sixth vertebra, and it's going to go to your hands. So if you have pain in your hand, it could be that you've got a problem up here in the neck. Just like I have a sensation here, I guess it's sensory, since I can sense it. And that would tell somebody who knows about these regions of the skin called dermatomes, that clues them into maybe some sort of damage up in the neck area. So if you got problems, you can see down the person's hand, you see C6, C7, or if you just have problems in your palm, it might be C8. So they would start looking not here, but they would look up here to see if there's maybe a collapsed disc or something like that, or maybe some arthritis or whatever, some bone spurs. Getting old is not a lot of fun, but one day I'll get a new body. Now, look at the bottom of the page, and you see this figure and all these different colors on the person's anterior and posterior aspects. So what they're pointing out here is what we call referred pain. So when somebody has a heart attack, and most of you know this, you see the left side of the chest hurts, and look at the arm on that. When you're in that anatomical position, then this part of your arm, which I guess we would call medial, there's pain there, and that alerts them to the fact that it's not your arm that's a problem, it's that your heart has a problem. And this, you could see the, for you girls, look at ovary. If you got a problem in an ovary, there's where it's liable to be. You see the little purple thing down there? Or any of you ever had kidney stones? Man, they'll get a hold of you, won't they? They'll put you on the ground. So you see, if you look over to the right and you see that person's dorsal surface, you see kidney, and that lumbar region on the side that the kidney is where the stone is in there blocking the flow of urine. So they know, oh, it's not something in your lumbar muscles or whatever, your back muscles, it's in your kidney. So they take you in, do an MRI or do a CAT scan or something like that. Okay, so much for that. One other thing I believe it is on page 506, and you see reflex arcs, module 13.6. So just come down to the bottom of page 506, and there's a reflex arc. It talks about them, and they have to have three components. And there they are at the top of the second column. Got to have a sensory section, afferent. It's going to take information to the central nervous system. That's the second component. And then you've got to send a message to an effector. And so there's where your motor nerve comes in. So any type of reflex has got those three components. Now, I think that takes care of, does take care of it. Okay. Takes care of chapter 13. Now, we've been talking for 50 minutes, or I've been talking, y'all been listening, probably writing like crazy. Why don't we take a little break, and then about, say, 2:30, I'll do another one. Okay, now these won't be ready today. They have to process this thing. So I'm going to end it. And then about 2:30, I'm going to start again, and we'll finish up this little chapter. Okay? I'm going to end it now.